So, diving into today's topic, quick show of hands, how many have read the chapter? Okay, so today's chapter is going to be covering gender as a broad topic, but also gender, sexuality, and various forms of identity construction. That might sound like a big mouthful. It's not nearly as much as it seems. There's always an impression from people that doing gender studies is easy. It tends to become far more complicated because it's not an academic discipline that works in isolation. It tends to draw on a variety of different tools. So if you were to go to, say, a women's studies or gender studies program at FDU or some other nearby institution, you'll find it draws on sociology, political science, literary studies, art history, and it becomes a pluralistic discipline. You need to have that balance of quantitative and qualitative analytic skills, and also a lot of self-analysis or the ability to think through your own situation in relation to the materials. So it does tend to become a little bit complicated. What we'll be covering is a quick discussion of what feminism means. Often people say, how can Professor Gifford be up at the front of class talking about feminism? Or, oh, I heard about that once and those people were supposedly mean. Just to make the point a little bit obvious, feminism is something that's changed over time in relation to its circumstances as an idea, and this is something we've talked about for other topics. You could say as an ideology, as a social belief. It reacts to its material conditions. Does that make sense? So what it means for people in different places, different times, different cultures, different classes, different economic conditions changes. So we'll look at how some of those major changes have come about, and also just a quick comment on our contemporary world. If I were to say to you, we live in a gender-biased, patriarchal world, you'll probably yawn and wonder why I'm emphasizing that. At least one person is yawning now. Literally. But if we were to stop and think through it, we do have gender distinctions in our laws for what men and women are allowed to do, especially in public space. We also have very deep-seated, you probably won't like the word, but ideologies, personal discomforts over what our gender identity allows us to do. There are things that will be shown and not shown, or ways of behaving or not behaving, that tend to be strongly self-regulated. For instance, if it grows hot here in the summer, any one of the lads in the room is allowed to go to the beach and take off his shirt. That becomes more complicated for women in a legal sense, but not just legal. It becomes something that's self-regulated. So we do have a broad variety of infiltrations of gender and belief systems around it. By the way, gender doesn't mean sex, as in biological sex. Gender is the social construction of these ideas of masculine, feminine, and so forth. That means it's tied to a variety of other forms of identity. We'll look at three writers who've discussed gender, Radway, Ang, and Winship. Jan Radway is the one I'll probably talk about the most. She's quite interesting. Her major book was Reading Romance, which you'll discover in more detail as you work through the chapter. Radway focused a lot on what women actually do while consuming romance, and then tried to articulate ways that romance serves a particular function for those readership groups. And she's awfully nice. Then we'll look quickly at masculinities and wrap up with queer theory. This is Rosie the Riveter, a figure for female liberation that became popular during wartime because women had opportunities that were not available to them previously in North America and Britain. For instance, entering the factories and doing factory work. So Rosie the Riveter was taken up as a form of female emancipation, independence. Women could, because men were not as available, enter the workforce, earn their own money, and work in previously masculine jobs. There was a pushback against that after the war, but it was one of those moments where once granted, it's difficult to take something back. It was taken back, but it met with more resistance and therefore changed over time. There's a couple of things to point out. First of all, we have plural feminisms to deal with multiple forms of inequality. So when we talk about feminism, we shouldn't talk about it in the singular. It changes over time, and there's also multiple forms of feminism at any one moment. And other forms of gender inequality, I should point out as well, when we talk about gender studies or feminism, we still use the word feminism, but it really has become more studies of gender than just one gender. So it's not oriented towards, say, women of one class or only women. It has become a much more broad, a much broader movement. We usually divide feminism up into three waves. Most of you would probably not know that you are third wave feminists, or most of you wouldn't know that you're first wave feminists. They're not hard, clear distinctions. There's overlap between them. Often the same people are involved in each stage. So understanding what each one is dealing with helps to keep it straight. First wave feminism tended to be most dominant up until, say, the 1920s, which is when predominantly Western nations gave women the right to vote, women's suffrage. It was about 50 years after African Americans gained the right to vote and slavery was abolished. Of course, that was then stymied or blocked or limited in a variety of states, but it was about 50 years later women got the right to vote. So in today's world, now that there's a black American president, we can probably assume in about 50 years there might be a female president. Or sooner, who knows. First wave feminism was largely focused on that right to vote. Apart from the right to vote, it also included things like the right to own property, the right to your own person, freedom from rape. These are things that we take for granted. So for instance, there were 18th century, 17th century, 19th century suffrage movements to grant women the right to self-determination. You might not think of it too often, but the right to own property or inherit was limited. If I'm doing, say, a traditional English course, I'll usually refer to Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice, which most of you will have at least heard of. The novel opens with a problem because there's a father who has a household of daughters and he's elderly. What happens when he dies?
Does it go back to the crown?
It goes to the next closest living heir, who is male, because his daughters cannot inherit his property. They must all be married off, or when he dies, they get thrown out of the house. They're at the whim of some stranger they don't know, because they're not allowed to own property. That kind of basic right is what first wave feminism focused on, gaining women the right to vote, suffrage, the right to own property, and the right to be legally a person. So we take first wave feminism for granted. We think that it's done. However, women still statistically earn less than men for the same labor. Second wave feminism was focused more on broader social inequality. For instance, were crimes of violence investigated, responded to, punished on an equal level? They were not. Were there prohibitions against women gaining an education, attending school, being allowed in public at different times? That's what second wave feminism tends to focus on. And we usually think of that culminating in the 60s moment, when women were, not universally, but many women were pushing back against strong restrictions in terms of their attire, what they could wear, prohibitions against particular kinds of work. Women could not be, let's say, business managers. They couldn't attend institutions of higher education. They couldn't be doctors. That tends to be associated with second wave feminism. And part of the shift for second wave is that it's not only concerned with the legal component, what are the rights in the courts, but also what's possible in the social circumstance. So you might have the right to something, but it doesn't mean you'll actually be able to do it. Or you might feel strong prohibitions, or people might find it ridiculous. Second wave feminism became more concerned with that. Do women have to wear dresses? What length of hair do they have to have? Do they have to display publicly when they introduce themselves their marital status? So for instance, if I were to introduce you as Miss, whatever your last name is, what information does that give to the person I'm introducing you to? Unmarried and marriageable. If I were to introduce you as Mr., it doesn't give anything away. So in essence, our language, and this is coded into many, many languages, our language will say, here is a young marriageable woman, here is a man. He might already be married, he might not, you don't know. You just have to wait and find out. So the introduction in the 1960s, seven-wave feminists started Ms. magazine. Ms. is not an abbreviation of anything, so don't follow it with a period, a full stop. It's just an invented term, but it means here's a way of introducing women who don't want to tell you I'm married or I'm unmarried in their introduction. Hi, I'm applying for the job. You can call me Miss So-and-so. I'm available for dating. Won't you hire me? As opposed to Mrs., meaning, oh, she's going to have babies soon. Maybe we don't want to hire her. Thanks for coming, Mrs. So-and-so. So that's what second wave feminism became more concerned with. And we might giggle over that. These things still exist. I am aware of, and will not comment on here, but I am aware of very real cases of prejudice in hiring practices, employment practices, retention of employees in businesses, in institutions of higher education right in this part of the world. It is not an uncommon thing in our everyday life still today. And people will excuse it in a variety of ways, but it's still what it is. It's still bigotry. Third wave feminism came after the 60s, but it involved a lot of second wave feminist figures. And this is the more complex problem. So we've talked about rights for women in general, voting rights for women. Many of those who campaigned for voting rights for women wanted women to have the right to own property and the right to vote so long as they were of the right European background. And the right European background didn't include the Irish and didn't include Italians. So race has always played a role in feminism as well. Third wave feminists wanted a more explicit discussion of how other social categories inform or complicate discussions of gender, both for men and for women. So what it means to be a man in America, take the US for example. If I were to ask you what it means to be a man in the 19th century in America, if I don't tell you the race of the man, am I leaving out a vital, crucial part of that form of identity? Today as well. If I say being a woman in the 21st century in Canada, if I don't tell you if the person is a new Canadian or immigrant or not, am I leaving out a massively important part of that person's life? What about to be a disabled person of either gender? What does it mean to be masculine but disabled? What does it mean to be feminine but poor? Or feminine but wealthy? So third wave feminists wanted to start tying this together and say, in any discussion of gender, you have to start including these other categories like immigration status, ethnicity, race, class, social status and wealth. All of those things will factor into the discussion of identity as well, and you can't discuss them in isolation. That's third wave feminism. For obvious reasons, you'll have shifts between legalistic, sociological, and then more activist movements in each of these three. You can't do third wave feminism if you're not going to have a plurality of methodological tools. So if you want to do purely analytic approaches and you're not going to be doing any kind of numeric studies or quantitative studies, you're not doing third wave feminism. It's intrinsically plural in terms of its methodological approaches. So those are the three standard ways. We call the last one postmodern because it sees identity as contingent on social conditions and how social conditions construct forms of identity. As a friend of mine likes to point out, just by way of explaining what that means, you can't have a patient without the social institution of a hospital. You can be sick, you can't be a patient. Social institutions go a long way towards determining our identity. You can be hungry, but you can't be a beggar if you don't have the same social institutions. Does that make sense? Okay. Concepts in feminism that come up pretty commonly in all three waves. Patriarchy. Patriarchy is a way of simply saying you have the rule by men. This is actually a really common misnomer, and I wanted someone to say it. Patrilineal means male descent or fathers. So patriarchy is rule by fathers. This is to point out not every man gets a great deal out of patriarchy. So rule by fathers. False consciousness, we've covered that term already, but just to remind you of it, if it were a very hot summer's day and if you were to be having a day at the beach and volleyball games and the sun was pretty strong, could the men take off their shirts because it's sweaty?
Yes.
Could the women?
If they want to.
This would be one way of discussing something like false consciousness. People may do things that are uncomfortable, or they may do things that run contrary to their own best interests because they feel it's normal or natural to do so. Likewise, they might avoid doing things that serve them best because they feel it's unnatural. That's one component of false consciousness. Obviously, false consciousness has a lot to do with gender. How many men here wear high heels? How well can you walk in high heels? How many men spend hours plucking hair from various parts of their face and body? or applying a variety of very harsh chemicals to their hair. So we have maybe one of you. We have these various ways of going about building our gender identity, doing things that make us feel comfortable about ourselves, feel as though we're doing what we're supposed to do, even if it takes up enormous amounts of time and actually runs contrary to our own best interests or our own comfort and safety. We'll invest an enormous amount of effort into things that really aren't very good for us because we believe it's natural and we'd feel uncomfortable if we didn't. Does that make sense? It's something that's actually quite straightforward. We all know it when we're doing it, and then we just push that knowledge way down deep inside where it won't bother anybody anymore, otherwise known as repression. Subject versus object comes up a lot in the textbook. In a grammatical sense, subjects do things, objects have things done to them. I hit the table, I'm a subject doing a verb to an object. In terms of subject-object in gender, when we look at how people are acted upon by things like the law and who the actors are, we often find women cast as objects, socially constructed as objects in our society. So giving women a subject position means giving them the opportunity to speak, to voice things, and become active agents in society, rather than passive objects on whom things are done, or to whom. The gaze is another concept that we've already covered, but just to reiterate it, when we look at social materials, especially things like pop culture, we construct a gaze. There's a height that a camera looks at you from, about eye level if you're 6 foot even is typical, or as tall as the male lead in any show. Likewise, we have constructions or a gaze in fiction, advertising, what have you. If you want a quick example of this, go outside, walk around the various bus depots, and look at the posters. What eye level are you at as the viewer? Because the camera has a position from which it takes the photograph or records the image. You're probably at the eye level of the tallest male in the picture. If not the tallest, the whitest. That's really, I mean, if it sounds nasty to put it that way, that really is what you're going to find. Because people might feel uncomfortable if it wasn't. If you looked at the bus stops and all the photographs were taken from someone who is supposedly about 5'2", you'd think it's a strange looking picture. That's not how ads look. It might be how your world looks. That's not how advertising looks. The same way we learn a variety of very unnatural things in films, like Hollywood's invisible editing, which is anything but invisible. It's giant jumps continuously, but we've trained ourselves not to see it. Same thing with advertising. So there's the construction of a particular gaze that you see the world through. That gaze is normal. So you know what position you're in when you see posters, advertising, films, television shows, and what have you. That particular eye spot you watch the world through is the gaze that you understand it from. And you'll code that as being the normal position. Most likely if you're female, that gaze isn't your own, which constructs women to see themselves and their position that they see the world from as abnormal. That's not the norm. Men can have the same position put on them as well. For instance, what does it mean if you're male and you're 5 foot even? We then have the concept of interpolation. We'll come back to that in the Marxism chapter. It's a complicated word that simply means drawing you into a particular perspective. So if I look at something, I construct myself within it. Actually, a great example is the one I gave of ideological state apparatuses, ISAs, in terms of being a patient as opposed to a sick person. You interpolate yourself as a patient. So if you go to a hospital, you've established a relationship between yourself and the institution and the people who work in it. You know what your position is. That's the process of interpolation. I'm becoming that thing that I'm being called as. So if I go to hospital sick, they call me as a patient and I behave as a patient. If a policeman calls me, I might think of myself as a criminal. But this interaction with state apparatuses or ideological institutions, those become things that shape and determine us. The same way an ISA, an ideological state apparatus, might exist in a word like wife. Are there things that are normal for wives to do that are abnormal for girls? Everyone looks at me blankly. Do wives date? Smiles around the room. I'll use the word girl intentionally, not woman. Are there things that it's normal for a girl to do that a wife should not? Mm-hmm. So these are ideological, cultural norms. We have the same thing for men, but is there a difference between being constructed as wife as opposed to being constructed as husband? Bear in mind, if one becomes a wife or a husband, that's your relationship to a state apparatus. There's a large legal mechanism standing behind that with a number of social institutions, which might include churches, taxation rates, what you get to keep from your income, how responsible you are for a child, what kind of Medicare you're entitled to. All of those things can change based on marriage. So that call, that interpolation as wife or husband, is actually quite complicated, and it has a lot of power, a lot of force behind it that we tend not to think about. We kind of know it's there, and then we just generally say, oh, it's just a word, I'm the same person as before. You really aren't the same person as before, in a social sense, in a legal sense. And then the last one, the textual unconscious, incorporates a lot of these things. We use this for films, we use it for books. When you read any particular work, it has an unconscious. Not in a literal sense. Your book doesn't say, oh, I'd really like to steal that candy from the baby. Oh gosh, I feel guilty about it. What can I do now to deal with my guilt? That doesn't happen in books or films. They do, however, have a wide range of assumptions that they make that aren't consciously thought of. A film will do these things without knowing why. I mean, films obviously don't know why they do anything because they don't have minds, but in that sense of being unconscious, there's a lot of stuff that just happens because it's accepted. It's not discussed in the film, it's not coded in a way to make you understand it. It's just assumed that all of you will know it. Same thing as reading a book, and you've got all sorts of people from various ethnic or racial minorities who are all evil, and the word policeman shows up, and you're ideologically coded to think, oh, must be male, must be white. That same sort of thing plays out in terms of the unconscious. Do all of those things make sense? You'll notice the queen here with her lovely little slippers and falsely constructed body shape that's not real, face painted whiter than white, probably using lead, which will kill her. All of those things fulfill a variety of ideological functions. She's actually standing on a map of Europe to demonstrate dominance in dainty slippers. So the same kinds of procedures are involved when you've got, say, a queen. In terms of women in cinema, this is a helpful example just to understand how feminism works, or how gender studies work, because it's coded so deeply into our visual culture. Even in this particular picture from Pretty Woman, compare the two waists. So one is of a guy who's probably got a little bit of a belly, and there's been no attempt to airbrush or pull his jacket in and you know, make him into the skinny male figure. In fact, his head is probably cut and pasted onto the top of another body. What about the female figure? Is that real? That's not real.
Way too skinny.
Way too skinny in the places where you can't be all that skinny. There's a lot of airbrushing and changes and so forth. This is a completely constructed image. Also in this particular film, Pretty Woman, the way that gender is constructed, the way that male and female roles are constructed, women are they're placed in the film purely as sexual objects to rich and powerful men who own property. And in the end, everyone's happy with that. Which really isn't a good thing. We do have, however, in popular culture and cinema, escapism, what we would call visual pleasure. There's actually an article on this called Narrative Cinema and Visual Pleasure that tends to be used quite a bit to discuss the gaze in film. By constructing a particular form of pleasure, a particular form of visual pleasure or escapism, you're coding things that can be normal or abnormal. What is it normal to take visual pleasure from? What position do you watch it from to get visual pleasure? Even in this particular poster, whose body is more visible? Are you a man or woman when you look at the poster? How tall are you when you look at the poster? Because they're making eye contact with you. There's all sorts of things going on there that we often overlook. So we have, it promotes resignation, not antagonism. This is the whole nature of visual pleasure in cinema. You don't walk out of cinemas usually saying, I'm so angry that that film looked that way, unless it's really choppy, Blair Witch Project or whatever films have. There's lots of jokes you can make about video editing was done by someone who's twitchy. We tend not to have that. We are constructed as passive viewers who enjoy the visual pleasure of the cinema. Passively, we don't think about our own bodies when we're in films. We're supposed to be invisible viewers who people cannot see. I'm invisible and I get the pleasure of watching them unseen. No one looks at me when I'm watching a film. Make people uncomfortable. Because of this, we say that cinema teaches hegemony. It teaches forms of social control. Not necessarily in a conscious sense. That isn't to say people make movies in order to keep a population happy and content and peaceful and placid. It's just convenient that way. It's a better market. If you make people angry when they go to see your film, so they go out and do something, then they're not watching your next film. So it's not a deliberate strategy in that sense. So more than giving pleasure, it teaches you what to want. Another way of rephrasing that is that when we're watching cinema, we're not being given what we desire, we're being taught how to desire. What things should we like? What body shapes should we like? What positions should we enjoy watching them from? Where is the camera watching from? Is that normal or is it coded as abnormal? So it's not just giving me what I desire. You're usually a relatively neutral figure with your own personal background when you go to see your first film. Cinema over time, like novels, like any kind of popular entertainment, doesn't just give you what you want. That's the reductive, dare I say, capitalist version. I'm a free consumer, I make my own decisions, I vote with my pocketbook. If it gives me what I want, I'll pay for it. If it doesn't give me what I want, I won't. Keep in mind that second function. It doesn't just give you what you want, it teaches you how to go about the process of wanting. It doesn't give you your desires, it teaches you how to desire. And then at the last end, as ideology, cinema in particular, but I mean any popular material, it reflects the base of existing circumstances. So if I wrote romance novels about women who don't need men, they're not romance novels. They probably won't sell. If I have the chick flick phenomenon, films for women, they're usually not dramas, they're usually going to be comedies. They're not going to be action adventures where women punch people out. Those are relatively rare. There'll be romantic comedies for women who fall in love. And women learn that falling in love is what women are there for. You have many other things in your life that may be wonderful other than the purpose of falling in love. That doesn't mean you shouldn't fall in love, but it's not the only thing in your existence. But these films will show that as the ultimate endpoint for every female endeavor. But they're marketed towards women, and women will buy them and drag men to go see them when those men don't want to see them. The camera will still be about 6 foot tall, and we'll spend more time looking at women's bodies than male bodies, even though it's supposed to be for female viewership. So it reflects the base. It reflects the existing social circumstances. We can't have a mainstream popular cinema that is anti-patriarchal because we still have a patriarchal society. Likewise, men, when you have those same films, will be presented either as rich or strong, or ideally, rich and strong, which is not necessarily in every man's best interest. Some of us are weak and poor, and we might still want to find potential mates. So that's one approach. We also have Radway, Ang, and Winship. Just to emphasize the point, read the book here. I'm not going to summarize them in full. Radway's book, Reading Romance, tried to look at, first of all, what women do, how they consume romance novels. Romance novels are the biggest publishing industry in the world. Harlequin is the world's largest publisher. So if you're talking about commercial viability, business success, romance novels, they sell. So Reading Romance looks at both production and consumption, but also the process of women consuming. What do they like? And it's not just weak women finding a man who can save them from some bad circumstance. For Radway, in interviews with large numbers of reading groups that she then statistically compiles and looks for statistical anomalies and so on, what is the real purpose behind reading romance? She comes to argue that it has to do with women finding a particular type of male figure to invest in. She argues that's largely a regression to maternal attachment. They're looking for a maternal man. Doesn't mean that the women want to find that themselves. That's what they're looking for in their reading habits. So if you look across romance novels, there's usually 2 men, almost always. 1 woman, 2 men. One of the men will be strong and masculine and probably rich, and he'll turn out to be a jerk. And then there'll be another man who is actually able to care and nurture the female character and basically give her the kind of interest that is coded as female, what women are supposed to give to men. And that for Radway, after going through her large reading groups and looking at what people consume, which ones are the most successful, how people vote with their pockets and so on, leads her to argue women are interested in consuming romance that's about women attaining maternal attachment, but to a male figure. Ang, we've got this now because Dallas has been relaunched as another TV show. Ang looked at Dallas when it was the most phenomenal TV success and wanted to know why women were watching this in a particular fashion. What was their position in terms of consumption? Same thing for Winship inside women's magazines. Just one little clip I can drop in for your generation that might be a bit more of a spark. She's not named in our readings, but there's a fine scholar, Constance Penley, who wrote a very provocative piece on fan fiction. And she studied S/K fiction, which is Spock/Kirk. Fan fiction is when people write their own books or stories based on something they like to watch. Do any of you have a show you like to watch?
Yeah.
Would you think about writing a story about it?
Not really.
So fan fiction used to be quite common, still is. Actually still is surprisingly common. People will write their own continuations of this mythological universe they come to like. Spock/Kirk was when largely heterosexual women wrote a variety of, and large number of, quasi-pornographic Star Trek novels in which Spock and Kirk fell in love. And what she wanted to understand was why women would want to consume that. First of all, they're women. Secondly, they're straight. Why did they want to see Spock and Kirk fall in love? And her argument was that this gave a subversion of stereotypical masculine leadership figures, which is a fascinating thing. But fan fiction for your generation, you've all heard of Twilight. You've all heard of 50 Shades of Grey. Go find out. 50 Shades of Grey is the erotica books that have been very popular, lightly, loosely pornographic. They're just Twilight rewritten. So instead of Edward, you have Eduardo, and I think the vampires are now just people who bite someone. But it's just a rewriting of Twilight in quasi-pornographic terms. Fan fiction still exists, and it still constructs gender in very particular ways. So a quick question for that might be, does mass culture awaken desire for more than the everyday, but fulfill it through the hegemonic mundane? It awakens desires that you want more than you have. So maybe women should want a nurturing maternal man to attach themselves to who will reflect back the way that they are trying to present themselves. But really it just makes them better able to get by with the existing state of the world and not change anything. So the hegemonic mundane, by awakening a desire that it then satisfies without changing anything. Same thing, Conan the Barbarian. Although, well, I'll resist making too many comments. So we also have an ideological idea of masculinity. I'll go through this relatively quickly. We have lived masculinities, what people actually do and live. Then we also have third wave feminism. How is this constructed? Do men ever achieve the masculine ideal? Probably not. But women probably don't achieve the feminine ideal either. Does culture reflect a reality of gender, or does it reflect its own interests in gender? Gender is socially constructed. It doesn't necessarily reflect what people do with their lives. It reflects an ideal that we're all supposed to aspire to. And how does mass culture create men? How does it construct them? Those are complicated problems. I'll leave those for discussion when we get into the materials, but just to present that as one component. Likewise, queer theory. Queer theory is often approached as a way of confusing gender norms. First of all, queer doesn't just mean gay. It means anything outside of what is hegemonically normative. So that can have a variety of meanings. So queer is de facto antagonism towards the existing state of affairs. You can perform gender, recognize that it's always something you're making and doing, not something that's natural. Distinguish between gender and biological sex, or queer the norms, upset and subvert them. But a quick way of commenting on that is the sense of universal perversion we get from Freud, which is to say the only normal sexual thing is reproduction. Not kissing, not holding hands, all of those are perversions of the base drive. What makes some perversions more normal than others? Freud would argue just culture. We accept some forms of perversions, we don't accept other forms of perversions, but they're all perversions. So, to wrap up, questions we could ask, is anyone normal? How does mass culture create gender roles? How do you get gender roles that you consider normal from mass culture? Do gender norms derive from base or ideology? Do your conditions shape what you consider normal for a person in your class, background, race, ethnicity, economic condition, and so forth? And are these forms of social control? Those are questions you have to answer.